Hello and welcome to Unit 7, Entering the Modern Era. This will be the last unit we have in first semester for U.S. History. The next unit, Unit 8, is actually the final exam unit, so it's kind of exciting. We're already at the last unit of the first semester. So let's read about the concept behind Unit 7, Entering the Modern Era, and then we'll begin the 7.01 lesson. Post-Civil War America saw huge growth in many areas. Prospectors wandered the mountains of the West, ranchers drove cattle on the open range, and farmers spilled onto the Great Plains. As the Transcontinental Railroad connected east to west, new cities sprang up almost overnight along its path. New inventions made rail travel more practical and comfortable, and daily life changed in remarkable ways with the advent of amazing innovations. The railroad also spurred the growth of other industries, including steel and oil, whose leaders made unimaginable fortunes at the expense of competitors and workers. Workers fought back, uniting to demand better conditions and wages. The modern age had begun. And this actually is pretty exciting, entering the modern era. It really was a pretty significant change, so I am excited. Lesson 1, Settling the American West. After the Civil War, native-born Americans and newly arrived European immigrants poured onto the Great Plains. Millions of men displaced by the war went to seek their fortunes in the untamed West. Families went west too to escape urban poverty and to find a fresh start. Immigrants from China also helped settle America's last frontier as they worked from the West Coast building a railroad that would cross the country. Thousands of Irish immigrants worked to build the railroad from the east. When the two lines met in Utah in 1869, the miners, farmers, and ranchers of the West, as well as the city dwellers on both coasts, celebrated the news. The nation was on the move. Goals for today's lesson: explain the role of railroads in the settlement of the West. Describe the role of the U.S. government in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And lastly, describe the era of open-range cattle ranching and the reasons for its end. Daily checklist. We need to complete the warm-up, read the pages, reading guide, and complete the checkpoint. So before we move on, remember to go to lesson resources and grab your student guide or your reading guide or lesson answer key so you can follow along with the reading. But let's do the warm-up before we get into the reading. Railroads, mines, and ranches. After the Civil War, Americans looked again to the West. Many crossed the Mississippi to seek their fortunes on the mountains and plains of the nation's last frontier. Not all who settled in the West came from the United States, however. Thousands of Europeans braved the harsh climate of the northern plains, and Chinese and Irish immigrants and others worked on the railroads that were being built to link the nation together, including the first Transcontinental Railroad. Before beginning today's lesson, see what you may already know about the Old West. Okay, and this is our warm-up, the West. Decide whether each of the following statements is true or false. So we have a series of statements, and they're going to kind of test your knowledge, what you know, or preconceptions you might have going into the reading about the West. Was it really the Wild West, or was it different than what maybe old movies about old Westerns may have, how they may have portrayed the West at this time in U.S. history. So the first question, virtually all cowboys of the American West were white men. Do you think that's true or false? And I'm not going to mark anything right now. You can just do this in your own mind. Texas cattle ranchers used railroads to move their herds from southern Texas ranches to cattle towns such as Abilene and Dodge City. True or false? Next question. Geologists and speculators discovered large underground oil reserves in Texas in the late 1890s. Next, most of the settlement of the Great Plains resulted from the sale of privately owned land to settlers in 1862. Next, Virginia City grew into a thriving town of 15,000 due to the discovery of gold and silver. In the second half of the 19th century, Native Americans offered no resistance to attempts by the U.S. government to force them off their tribal lands and onto reservations. A gun duel between a town marshal and an outlaw gunman on Main Street was a fairly common occurrence in the American West. And lastly, the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869 at Promontory Point, Nevada. So let's check our answers. Let's say, show me. The first one is false. Not all the cowboys were white men. You'll learn about that, the Buffalo Soldiers. The next one is false because they did not use railroads to move their their herds. They were using cowboys to do that. Yes, they found gold or oil in Texas. Most of the settlement was not due to privately owned land. Much of it was due to the Homestead Act, which you'll learn more about. The next one is true about the discovery of gold and silver in Virginia City. This one here is false. They did offer resistance to attempts to move on to reservations. The gun duels were not common. That's a movie thing. That's not something that happened often at all. And the last one, it's false because it's Promontory Point, Utah. Not Nevada, but Utah. Okay, let's get on to the reading. So we have to go to page 460. So let's find page 460 and get to work. And we have, of course, that's the beginning of the chapter with the pictures and the timeline. And another picture and timeline. And here we go, the last frontier. In 1862, the artist Emanuel Lutz completed a 20 by 30 foot mural in the U.S. Capitol building. Lutz's work, in the pictures there, shows a pioneer wagon train winding its way up a steep mountain slope. A guide on the rocky trail waves his hand toward the promised land ahead, beckoning his followers to the forests and valleys of the frontier west. Bathed in the golden light of sunset, women cradle their babies, bearded farmers ride on horseback, and tanned riflemen stare into the nation's future. At the mountain's highest point, the front of snow-capped peaks that reach toward the sky, a man removes his cap and hoists an American flag. A blue scroll weaves across the upper border of Lutz's mural, its gold lettering proclaiming, "Westward the course of empire takes its way." In the half-century following the Civil War, Americans expanded their empire across the continent. But America's westward expansion is not, as Lutz's mural suggests, simply the story of individual pioneers setting out for a vast wilderness. Instead, it is also a tale of railroad, timber, and mining companies seeking to exploit the natural resources of the West. It is a tale of Native Americans, white migrants, and immigrants clashing over land. It includes as a leading character a strong federal government shaping the rate and course of expansion. It is, above all, the story of an ever-shifting frontier that was fast disappearing by the late 19th century. Settling the West. In the first decade of the 1800s, during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark explored the lands of the Louisiana Purchase. In the following decades, fur trappers made their way to the Pacific Northwest. In 1848, at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, a defeated Mexico ceded present-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, as well as parts of Colorado, Nevada, and Utah to the United States, thus extending the nation's territorial holdings from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. In 1849, when news spread of the discovery of gold in California, more than 250,000 fortune seekers from all parts of the globe quickly descended on the territory already inhabited by many Mexican ranchers and Native Americans. By the 1850s, as Americans proclaimed their manifest destiny, remember that concept, manifest destiny, to overspread the continent, thousands of pioneers were traveling to the Oregon and Santa Fe trails in covered wagons, hoping to find cheap, fertile land beyond the frontier. By 1860, the Mormon state of Deseret has grown into a prosperous and self-sufficient colony of 40,000 residents. And still more settlers continued to push into the region beyond the Mississippi after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad. In the spring of 1869, a boisterous crowd gathered at Promontory Point, Utah, a desolate little town of shacks, sagebrush, and scrubby cedars. They were there to celebrate what the New York Times called the completion of the greatest enterprise ever undertaken. The completion of a railroad spanning the United States, a transcontinental railroad. As recently as the 1830s, when railroads were still new in the United States, a few visionaries dreamed of running trains from San Francisco to New York. Most people thought they were crazy. Lay down tracks across thousands of miles of empty prairie, over mountain ranges, through unknown and often hostile territory? One member of Congress said they might as well try to build a railroad to the moon. But as trains proved to be a quick, cheap, easy way of moving goods and people, a web of railroad lines spread across the industrial East, reaching as far as the Missouri River. In 1849, when the California gold rush drew hordes of frenzied treasure seekers to the West Coast, the notion of building a transcontinental railroad no longer seemed so crazy. But what route would it take? Northern politicians wanted the railroad to run through northern states. Southern politicians wanted to take a southern route. During the Civil War, when representatives and senators from southern states resigned from Congress, no one was left to oppose the northern route. On July 1st, 1862, President Lincoln signed into law the Pacific Railway Act, an act to aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean and to secure the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. Other things were going on during the Civil War, remember that. Things like building the railroad. The Pacific Railway Act said that two companies would build at the same time. The Union Pacific Company would start where the current railroad stopped at the Missouri River and from there work west. The Central Pacific Company would start in California and work east. For labor, the Central Pacific Company turned to many Chinese immigrants who had recently arrived in California. At first, Irish railroad bosses doubted these small, slender men could do the job, but the Chinese proved to be steady workers who did just as much or more than any other crew. The Pacific Railway Act gave the Central Pacific the right to build only as far as the California-Nevada border, but the company protested. If they conquered the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountain range before their competitors reached California, why should they stop there? Why not keep laying tracks and winning huge amounts of money and land from the government until the two railroads met? Congress amended the Pacific Railway Act to allow each company to build as far and fast as it could. The race was on. One leader of the Union Pacific team, a former Civil War general named Jack Casement, ran his operation like a... And read this about the Pony Express too. It's always kind of neat. So later on your own, go back and read that about the Pony Express. But I'm going to keep reading on. Ran his railroad like an army. Fortunately, many of his men, including immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, and Germany, as well as former slaves, had also fought in the war, so they were used to taking orders. Sadly, they also needed their military skills for skirmishes against the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians, whose hunting grounds were being destroyed by the advance of the railroad. As the two competing railroads neared each other, the companies pushed their crews to work harder and faster. Buoyed by pride in the promise of higher wages, the men labored around the clock through blinding snowstorms and deadly avalanches. On May 10, 1869, the railroads met at Promontory Point for the great celebration. The two locomotives faced each other on the track, one facing east, the other west. A brass band stuck up a tune as the last two rails were carried forward. One was carried by a crew of Chinese workmen from the Central Pacific Company, the other by Irish laborers from the Union Pacific. The final spike sat ready to be hammered into the tie. Not an ordinary iron spike, but one made of California gold. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, raised a silver-headed sledgehammer. As the golden spike slipped into place, a telegraph operator tapped out a one-word message that sped to distant cities and towns. Done. The facing locomotives inched closer and closer until the drivers could reach out to shake hands. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, the American people were now linked by the Transcontinental Railroad. In the decades ahead, many more thousands of miles of track were laid across the United States. By the 1890s, 5 transcontinental railroad lines crossed the country. The growing network of railroads linked one-distance parts of the country and spurred the growth of a national economy as goods moved promptly and cheaply from one region to another. I actually am going to go back and read this about the Pony Express. In 1860, when no railroads stretched across the western part of the United States, people still wanted a quick way to move their mail across the continent. So a group of Missouri businessmen decided to start their own speedy private mail service using a relay system. They called it the Pony Express. With 400 fast ponies or horses, 80 young riders, and more than 150 stations, the Pony Express could deliver mail between St. Joseph, Missouri and Sacramento, California, nearly 2,000 miles apart in 8 days. Their service lasted only about a year and a half because it could not compete with the much speedier innovation. In 1861, Americans finished building a telegraph line across the continent, and the Pony Express went out of business. But for something that only lasted a year and a half, it's been a lasting reminder of American innovation and spirit, the Pony Express. Okay, we're going to stop here for this first part of the video, and we'll start with the second one at a diverse mix.